Alright people, today we're going to talk about how to use guidelines in order to block in your still life. The way that we're going to do that is we're going to do three things that in our art brain. We're going to look for basic shapes, which are going to be used to build the forms. We're going to look for negative spaces to help us break down complicated relationships and complex objects. And we're going to look at proportion to make sure that everything is sized appropriately compared to what we just drew. So step one is to determine how big you want your still life to be. Is it going to be horizontal, vertical, square? How are you going to lay it out? After you've made your choices, you've got your layout and everything, you want to start with, grab your paper and always kind of imagine halves and quarters. That's the first thing. I actually break down the proportions of the paper before I break down the proportions of the objects. Now, you do not need to actually put a grid on your paper by any means. However, if you're just starting out, sometimes it's nice to put a tiny little dot in the center or little tiny hatch lines on the halfway or even like a quarter of the way. As it turns out, in my still life, the place where the table meets the wall, which is my first main grounding element, is actually almost exactly at a quarter of the way through my composition. It is just like the barely smidgen above a quarter of the way up in my whole composition. So I'm actually going to put that whole line there right now. Even though all of this line is blocked, I'm going to use it as a guideline, and I'm going to erase everything that I don't need later on, but it's going to help things stay grounded. Now I'm going to move on and start with my most basic form, which is the kind of slightly altered cylinder of the plant pot. The plant pot goes pretty much to almost to the halfway point. So if the halfway across from side to side is right there, the plant pot goes to about here. And it starts a little, not quite a quarter of the way, like maybe about here is where it starts. That's its two kind of widest edges. And its widest edge is actually down here, and it's up here. Now there's two parts to the plant pot. There's the top, and then there's the little bowl, the dish part that it sits in. I'm going to start with the top. Now I've established that at its widest, it goes to about here. And I've noticed that it goes just above halfway in my paper composition, like in my view. So it ends just above halfway. And that's actually kind of the bottom part of the ellipse ends at that halfway. I can't see the top part because that is where the plant is. It's a really dense plant, but I'm still going to draw it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw myself a horizontal line marking the width of the opening of the ellipse. Now I can see how open the oval is. So remember, the oval is the circle in perspective is called the ellipse. It indicates that circle in perspective. And I know that an ellipse is going to be even in the 4 quadrants from this point of view. So I'm going to make sure that when I draw my oval, when I draw my ellipse, I'm keeping the 4 quadrants kind of even, and I'm using these guidelines to help me out with that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to continue my vertical line. My plant pot is sitting pretty vertically on the table, so I'm going to continue that vertical line straight down to where it ends, which is right about here. And then the dish part starts and pretty much right away and is about this thick. Now, to know about how I keep saying about this big, about that big, I'm looking at relationships. This is where proportion comes in. So I can say if this opening is this big, and I can sight measure that in space, I can sight measure it on my table, I can say that, okay, the opening of the ellipse that I can see is a slightly smaller than the width of the base plate, so I can mark how wide that is in relationship to each other. I can also double check by saying, okay, if this base piece is this big, how many of those would stack above it to fit before I hit the top of the plant? So if this is an imaginary 1 from here to here, I can go, this is 1, 2, 3, and maybe a half. And I can check that by sight measuring in space by lining up my pencil, extending my one arm, and measuring that distance. So if this is that 1, 1, 2, 3, and a little bit more. And that looks good to me. So I'm going to leave it there. All right, so now we need to do the sides of our basic shape to form now that we've double checked our proportion and our proportion is good. I'm going to look to see how far in, when does this curve start, where does it end, and I'm also going to throw in a little negative space here to double check. So where the table meets the wall, where the table meets the wall, there's actually part of the ellipse of the base, little base plate thing is coming down at an angle. So the wall, the table to wall gets this kind of negative space here, this little V bird shape. I'm looking at that to help me determine where my plant pot is going to curve in. Because it does kind of curve in just ever so slightly until right around where it starts to get close to the table, and then it curves in pretty drastically like this. And I'm using this center guideline, using my guideline, to help make sure that the left and the right are even. Okay, now under this part there's another little kind of stem, and that's where our bottom dish, which the center of the bottom dish is not is under in the center of this. It's not down here. And we know this is a symmetrical object, so I know that this ellipse is also going to be symmetrical. I know that this distance and this distance are pretty much the same. And I can make some adjustments. So I'm stacking the ellipses on this basic cylindrical form, checking those proportions, checking those ratios, drawing in the extra things, and then I will erase them afterwards. Again, I'm doing this a little bit darker just because of the video so that you can see it. Try to do this as lightly as possible and have a decent eraser handy. Don't press hard, you'll end up denting your paper. Just really, really lightly. Now the next two forms on my composition are a little bit more simple. So I have a book and I have a pencil case. The book is basically just a rectangle, and the pencil case is a like triangle-sided prism. So it's two rectangles with a triangle on the side connecting them. So the important part for this is to make sure that my angle is correct. I'm going to look at that relationship of where the book is just snug right behind the plant pot. It's just barely off the horizontal. So the angle of it is just barely off straight. And I know from how big my composition is that it goes to this far over on the paper, which is not quite as far as where my pencil case will go. My pencil case will go a little bit longer. So I'm going to block in very lightly, just that basic side. I know it's just barely off the horizontal and barely off the vertical to give it that angle, and I'm not worrying about any other details at this time. The pencil case actually blocks a lot of this, which is great because I wasn't super happy with how this part came out. I'm going to lighten it up a little. And it goes in front of it, so negative spaces will be coming into play. This is actually also blocked by another object. I'm just lining up this angle, the overlap, and I'm going to take this line, and I know it goes kind of like so, a little bit up, and then it goes down. Now this is the triangle part that I was talking about. I'm looking for that basic triangle shape, and this is going to help it look like it's actually sitting on the table as well. It's really important. And even though this part is kind of narrow, there is a change in plane here. So I'm building this on its basic shapes to indicate the different planes, the different sides of the form. So the top rectangle, this tiny skinny little, this is where the zipper is, and the triangle on the side plane there. Again, I'm leaving it for now. I'm going to go move on to my final two things, and I've saved the best parts for last. Oh, before I move on, I lied. There's one more. There's also a handle, a little zipper pull, like a little handle strap on this. Now the strap, from what we can see, kind of it's a curved rectangle situation. And we're seeing the front on one part and the side on the next, and it switches sides. So it's a little bit more complex than some of the other forms, but if you think of it as kind of just a rectangle that curves into space, it's not that complex. And for this one, we just see kind of like a little opening here. And that is what we see of that little strap. Okay, fun part, the scissors. The scissors are where the negative spaces are going to come into full action here, because the scissors have lots of openings. They have an opening in the handle, they have an opening between the handles. Those are going to be a lot of fun. So we're going to block in just part of them to get started. The first thing I'm going to look at to get going is I'm going to look at the space between the handle strap and the handles of the scissors. And I'm actually going to draw this air shape, the shape that's here. I'm going to draw that because it's kind of a funky shape. But what that does is it helps me really look to make sure that I'm getting the scissors in the right spot. So if I know this is correct, I can then look at this and say, okay, that's a little too angled or a little too open, and I can really get that edge of the scissor opening more accurate. Now inside this part, this is the part of one of the hand pieces, there's an oval, and I'm going to draw that negative oval. And then I'm looking at the tan of my table almost exclusively to get this to work properly. Because scissors are notoriously uneven. Scissors are often just slightly different from other scissors. So no matter what the shape ends up being, a lot of times we want to rush through it and just draw what we think it's supposed to look like, but don't do that. Take your time, look at the negative spaces, and it will reveal the form. So I'm going to skip over the rest of this part. I know it's an angle, and I'm also imagining this space as kind of a distance and an angle here. So I know my other scissor handle piece is going to end here, because I've made an imaginary triangle to complete this negative space. And from here, I'm going to put in the other little shape, just shaped more like a D than an O. And voila, we build the scissors. And notice how I'm just drawing right over the thing before it. I don't care about drawing on top of something, because when you're blocking in, things are on top of other things. So it's okay, it's probably better actually, to look for those overlaps and look for those intersections, because it'll help make sure that everything's in the right spot. Because I can then see like, oh, this is just a little too close. I need to put this just a little more thin so that it's got, I've noticed this negative space here was too small, which I thought this base plate was too big. So now I can make it a little smaller and everything else is going to fall into play a little bit more. All right, so I know that this isn't all the way done, but this is how you're going to get started. The most fun part for me is going to be figuring out these plants. I'm going to think about kind of giving myself a basic direction for some of the major forms. The major clumps are kind of formed into two triangle-y spaces like this. So I'm going to give myself some basic shapes, even for something very organic and complex, to just keep me focused, and then I'll erase later as I go. Use your negative spaces to help figure out in complicated forms and double check where your spacing's at. Always keep proportion in mind, small pieces to big pieces, or entire objects to other entire objects, and you will be pretty successful at this. Remember to draw it light until you get it right. Oh, I messed up. I messed up the rhyme. Draw it light, okay? So that you can erase. Good luck.